Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Oxford Internet Institute's third webinar of the term, entitled Empirical Investigations of Platform Creativity, with Dr. Christopher Erickson, Associate Professor from the School of Media and Communication at the University of Leeds, in conversation with Professor Philip Howard of the OII. A little housekeeping. We are fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request that the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. You can pose any question using the Q&A tab at any time, and these will be answered towards the end of the talk. And please try and keep questions as concise as possible. The questions will be visible to all attendees and can be upvoted and commented upon, and we will endeavour to follow up on any unanswered queries. Please allow me to introduce Professor Philip Howard.
Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Erickson today. We've had a long association, and I'm constantly revisiting. Actually, one of the most interesting projects I've ever done was a simple task that produced a data set of privacy breaches. And this was a project that I developed in partnership with Dr. Erickson. And what was really interesting is I think that the way in which it showed how the process of producing policy is actually something that's lived and produced and violated by people as they actively use technologies. And Chris has gone on in several different interesting ways to continue that mission of studying people who produce policy when they build things, when they crowdsource. Chris has been a professor now at several universities, Bournemouth, he's worked at Glasgow, he's now at Leeds. He's a geographer, has crossed over in some ways into communication and media studies. And so his research speaks to several lines of inquiry. Welcome, Chris. Thank you for agreeing to tell us a little bit about your current work and what you're thinking about now. We may turn the floor over to you for 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, and then you and I can have a conversation, and we'll open it up to questions ending at the top of the hour. So welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Phil, for that introduction. I'm just going to start sharing my screen now. One moment. So hopefully you should be able to see my slides. So thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me and for this opportunity to share with you research that I've been involved with over the last, I'd say, 5 or so years, which are focused on this question of innovation policy and creative industries policy and the role of intellectual property rights and platforms in the processes of creativity online. So when I came to this area of research, it was very much through funded research by the Intellectual Property Office in the United Kingdom and by the Economic and Social Research Council. And we were tasked with coming up with evidence to support changes to copyright law in the United Kingdom that would enable more user-generated content in the form of parody, text and data mining of copyright materials, and the kinds of activities that users engage in on these platforms. And one thing that struck me was how, 2 things, actually. One was how much the policy discourse is shaped by economics as a field and a discipline. And also that when we talk about creative industries policy in the UK and abroad in mainland Europe and in North America, oftentimes we think about it in terms of how much do copyright industries bring to the GDP, let's say, of a nation. And so there's this like national accounting exercise around what have been called the copyright industries. And if we try to propose alternative policy approaches to platform regulation or to online remakes or those sorts of things, we have to confront that body of economic evidence, which is really focused on look how much money the copyright industries bring to the economy. Now, there have been alternative approaches to measuring these things. For example, what we might call negative space activities, like things which fall outside of copyright, things like the fair use economy. So the CCIA has a really interesting report, which is kind of like the opposite, the counterpart of the copyright industry's report, saying, look how much is generated actually through borrowing and using stuff which is under copyright. And there's been research on all sorts of really interesting field sites like French chefs and roller derbies and television formats and things like that, which sort of bolster this alternative story. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm basically trying to generate empirical evidence which addresses these questions of what are the appropriate policies in online creative spaces, not taking the assumption that stronger copyright and other proprietary forms of protection are the best, but considering alternative, maybe counterfactual, trying to enumerate the wider uses of works which may or may not be in copyright. So some of the aims of this talk today, basically I've got two things that I hope to accomplish here. One is to think about what are some mechanisms by which value in different forms is generated through intellectual property protection or negative space norms, for example, peer production, commons-based peer production. And in there we have some sub-questions. So one of the things that I'm exploring at the moment is, what precisely is the role of an exclusive license if you obtain a copyright license in value capture? How much role does intellectual property really play in the ability of creators and participants, firms, and organizations to appropriate the value of that creative product? Another question is, sort of has to do with the sociology of organizations and collectives. And that is, how do proprietary or open orientations shape downstream creative uses? So if a firm has a really proprietary perspective on value capture and appropriation, how does that shape the way that fans and audiences and other users engage with their content? And are there differences in those sorts of cultures? And increasingly looking at curation as a type of labor, which might be part of the process by which economic value is produced through the creative endeavors of humans, that sort of sits outside of normally what's covered by intellectual property regulation. And the reason why platforms are important here is, that these are the places where a lot of the action is taking place, right? And of course, we know that at the moment we have debates about the appropriate level of regulation of online platforms with regard to a range of different social ills and harms and opportunities, including misinformation, as Phil has studied, but also when it comes to creative expression. And we have recently in Europe had quite a significant change to the regime of intermediary liability for platforms. So we can maybe think in a discussion after the talk about what are some areas that we need deeper understanding in order to improve policy. All right, so I'm going to talk about two studies. The first study is a paper which came out a couple of years ago, and it was about the Wikimedia Commons, which is a repository of audiovisual files, mainly imagery, which one of its functions is sort of like a hosting site, a feeder site for photos which appear in Wikipedia articles. But people use it for a variety of things. So images which are uploaded to Wikimedia Commons can be found in loads of spots. One interesting insight here by Giger and Halfaker, who've studied Wikipedia extensively, is the extent of the labor which goes into creating and generating Wikipedia content. They estimated 102 million hours across the whole Wikipedia when they studied it in 2013. So it's an enormous undertaking from a resource and cost point of view. And the other great thing about Wikimedia Commons for this study is that it contains a lot of rich metadata. You know, and you can see some of that in the image on the right here, that you get the file size, you get file format. As you dig deeper, you also get information about licensing and things like that. So we came to this with two research questions, and my co-authors here is, one is a computer scientist, and the other one is a computer hacker from the Canary Islands, which is a great person to have as a co-author. So one question is, you know, does the licensing of these images, the type of licensing, impact the way that they are used on the Wikipedia family of pages, but also off-site? And how is value generated via the process of Wikimedia Commons volunteers? Obviously, Helfiker has studied Wikipedia editors, but what's going on the Wikimedia Commons? And you can maybe see and anticipate here that our goal is to say, hey, you know, there's an awful lot of activity going on in terms of uploading, sharing, and curating imagery. What is its impact overall in society? So the way we approached it was through a random sample of 10,000 images. And we used the Wikimedia API to do that. We scraped all of the main variables that we needed for the study that we could get from the individual pages of the images that were returned for our search. And those are things like, obviously, this file type, but really interestingly, what sort of license it's licensed under. So is it Creative Commons? Is it you know, GPL or some other attribution? And then what we did, and this was where the computer hacker proved to be very helpful, was we automated a system that could go and check where the image appeared off-site by reverse image searching on each one using an automated web browser. So basically we ran a Google reverse image search on all the 10,000 images to see how many places they appeared off Wikipedia. And just some descriptives here. So in terms of the license types for our sample of 10,000 images, the majority of them were Creative Commons with attribution and share alike. We can maybe get into what that means later in the discussion. Almost 20% of them were in the public domain or under some sort of public domain, you know, attribution. 16% just Creative Commons with attribution, and then a range of other license types. So Creative Commons is a very important licensing mechanism as far as imagery on the Wikimedia Commons is concerned. Now, we used a very rough measure for trying to figure out the nature of the off-site use, right? Because when we did this Google reverse image search, we received all the, you know, tens of thousands of hits actually, but we had to find some way of sort of classifying them. And the quickest and machine readable way was just to look at TLDs. So here's the breakdown of the total sample, where, you know, about roughly half of them appeared on commercial TLDs, and then country code domains. And you can't tell much from that because those could include a mix of commercial and non-commercial uses, .org and the rest. We did a binary logistic regression and OLS regressions on the likelihood, the odds of use of a single image on an offsite page, which is what this regression model shows. So here the coefficients are odds ratios. And the way that we interpret these is that a coefficient that's higher than 1 is associated with a positive association with that variable. And if it's under 1, then that's a negative association. So here we see that there's a positive association between an uploader uploading their own work to Wikimedia Commons and that image appearing somewhere off of the Wikipedia family of pages. But what's really interesting here are the other variables. So quality image here denotes an image which has been curated and given a metadata tag which notes it as being a quality image. And these are associated significantly with higher odds of use off of Wikipedia. And interestingly, the type of Creative Commons licenses which include additional requirements, like the requirement that the end user give credit to the original creator, which is CC BY, or share alike, which requires that the user also offer the image under the same open license. Those are associated with lower odds of use off-site. So they do seem to have an impact on restricting the eventual downstream use compared to images which are licensed or offered under a total public domain license, which doesn't have any requirements. So 34% of the total sample were used off-site at least once, with a mean usage, very skewed distribution of about 5.5 uses per image. And quality tagging is associated with significantly higher odds of usage. And I think that's a really interesting thing to explore further. We also investigated value. We tried to assign some sort of welfare calculation to the total corpus of open imagery, which is associated with Wikimedia Commons, and that's in the paper, which we'll distribute, and you can look more into that. It's a very crude measure, but this is again, it's an attempt to sort of try to put some sense of scale and importance on all of the work which is going into these images. Okay, I want to cover the second paper, which is a qualitative study. And here, this is related to the other paper. It's about what happens when creative entrepreneurs and firms do what some folks appear to be doing with Creative Commons imagery, which is that they're using it. And I was very inspired by the work by Eric von Hippel and von Crow, who developed this idea of private collective innovation. And why it's so helpful to me is just that it kind of just puts into perspective the idea that the reason why somebody might offer something for free in a volunteer creative community or use something for free is that the threshold for giving something away for free is pretty low. And oftentimes you might have complementary benefits, or what they call selective incentives for doing so, which are just enough to induce the kind of sharing activity. So it helps to understand the motivation for why people do this. But when firms borrow things from the open collective communities of the world, they also take certain risks and costs on board. So some of the literature talks about integration or transient incompatibility costs. Also potential penalties for lack of originality, and Ben Mako-Hill and his co-authors have studied this extensively in a very interesting paper. Also direct competition from other users of the same open and available material. But all of that stuff was studied in the context of software, most of it anyway, in the contents of software, and hardly any has focused on the copyright industries, as they're calling it, right? And creative products. So this paper was about how creative firms, whether they encounter similar kinds of costs or risks when they use stuff which is freely available and open. And we did it by searching on known lists of public domain and open available materials, such as the Project Gutenberg book list, a great resource called the Public Domain Review, which highlights things that are available in the public domain. And doing that, we located some 45 creative industries firms in the UK. And the study was focused on the UK. It was funded by UK funders. And we managed to secure interviews with 23 of those firms. And some of those firms are on the right in the table here. I list some of them. And you get a sense of the kinds of works which they are appropriating, which made them candidates to be included in our sample. So for example, this really interesting company called 3 Turn Productions, which has made a massively online multiplayer game based on the works of Jane Austen. So that is the type of appropriation of something which is available and free and open to take, which we're interested in. So the paper really had two objectives. One thing which came across from the paper was that creative industries firms deal with much the same issues which you find in the innovation management literature when it comes to dealing with open source software development communities. So things like, for example, rationales for engaging with free and open material were things like getting to market the fastest, skipping steps which allowed them to develop a prototype quickly using free and open inputs, and compete on speed rather than on exclusivity, and other kinds of strategic, approaches which came through in the interviews. But one thing which was different in our study was that some firms, I'd say roughly a third of the firms that we talked to, were kind of radical in their relationship with open and collective project communities, because some of them took something from an open project, and then when they released their own take on it and their own product, they then opened that to user innovation and user inputs. And so they actually were, in a sense, open at both ends of the value chain, and they were part of different private collective innovation communities, if you want to use von Crow and von Hippel's language. So just to give you a couple examples of these. So one is a company in the UK called Red Wasp Entertainment, and they made a computer game based on the mythos of H.P. Lovecraft's science fiction. And I liked the way that the project lead explained their openness, saying, if a public domain story has nothing interesting done to it and people just kind of venerate it, it traps it in amber. I think it's important that you're growing something for fans because obviously they want to see more stuff come out. When they don't get it, they'll make it themselves. And where they do get it, they'll make it themselves anyway, but more so. And where this firm saw its place was in that last part of the paragraph, that their job was to help other fans of this material, which was free and open, to make more of it and do it well. So they almost designed their game and their products as platforms for further generation and expression on the part of users. And the way that they captured the value and appropriated the value from their innovation was more through relationships with norms-based communities and fandom communities than through any kind of worrying about exclusive protection. And this touches a little bit on cultural heritage, which is another area of interest of mine. This example is an entrepreneur from Bristol who published a series of books based on Bristol's history. And he found it incredibly useful to engage with the Internet Archive because they have collections of old historic texts relating to Bristol. So that's kind of like an upstream private collective that he's pulling free and open inputs from. But he explained one story that one day in Bristol, he got a knock on the door and a bunch of steampunks showed up, and they wanted to know about Bristol's history so that they could produce products, games, and stories based on real history of Bristol, interpreted through him. And then they took it a step further and developed this book and developed this further genre based on material that he had originally gotten from the Internet Archive. So there's this really interesting sort of chain of value flowing from, not-for-profit, maybe archives and museums, through entrepreneurs and through new sets of users. So to summarize the main ideas from my just these two papers, I think two things stand out. One is the possibility that we might see virtuous circles of openness, where having a project where the licensing is open permits users to open the license for their own purposes and new sets of users. If there's a closure or a forking of an open thing, just like in open source software, it creates issues and problems and it can hinder further development. So the licensing environment from sort of beginning to end along this chain is very important for sustaining these kinds of innovation. And an important thing that I would like to explore further is the possibility of the way that curation adds value in these contexts. And we saw how important the quality tag was in terms of picking out the images of the vast quantity of 45 million images that might have some quality or value for others, and then how that enabled them to be searchable, to be found, to be made visible to other further users. And so there's a tremendous amount of work that goes in there. And I'm really interested in research by colleagues there at Oxford, such as Gina and F, about the possibility that some of this data work, if you like, is hidden. And I wonder if curatorial kinds of value creation aren't similar in some ways there. In terms of wish lists for things I'd like to do next, just to close, this will be my last slide before we have a discussion with Phil. I'm really interested in what happens when private collective and commons-based communities come in contact with external markets. And so I'm working on a project at the moment, very early stages, which I'm looking at enthusiast web forums for things, for old objects, like imagine old record players or old photographic cameras and things like that, where there's a community, but then there's also eBay. And I'm interested to know how these non-market, more norms-based kinds of exchanges deal with the problem that there's a market outside of their forum where scarcity and other forms of demand may be driving up prices for the same object. And I think there could be some interesting work in there. And the other thing which I'm interested in is, of course, the changing policy landscape to do with a platform's role in all of this. Platforms like YouTube and Kickstarter and Twitter and TikTok, all of them, right? And one thing I'm concerned about and interested in exploring is when we change, let's say, for example, we change the burden of responsibilities when it comes to intermediary liability, and we require that platforms have a higher standard of rights clearance before a user is allowed to make a remix or a fair use of an underlying copyright material. I wonder how much of the work of doing that diligent search and rights clearance may in some ways be passed along to users who actually fill in metadata relating to works that either they want to use or others want to use. And so kind of seeing where the costs are allocated when policies like that are changed. So I think I will end there. That's about 25 minutes, and I'm really happy to carry on the discussion with all of you.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, everyone, this is the moment to contribute some questions. Pop them into the Q&A, please. And I'll start off asking you a little bit about some of the valuation numbers you have. So it's really, of course, fascinating that you could even guesstimate that the collectively curated images in the Wikimedia Commons are worth 29 billion. And in the second paper is also a little bit about the process of valuing this effort and valuing this work. Knowing what you know about what creates value in this way, what are the options for returning some of that value to the communities? Realistically, I mean, you could imagine that Wikimedia, the Wikimedia Foundation, is not is always asking for funds, right? It always needs support. It's pretty sustainable, but also in some ways dependent on a few donors. Why not try to, are there license variations or IP variations that actually you think could sustain the creative community and return some of that value to the community itself? Wow,
great questions, Phil. And I think some of them I can do my best to answer, and others are just questions worth contemplating. So on the first point about the value, how we did the calculation, we came up with 29 billion US dollars for the total corpus. So we used a method which was devised by a colleague over in America at the University of Illinois named Paul Hild. And what he discovered, he loves digging through old images and lists of novels from the 19th century, things like that. He found that there were identical images on Wikipedia as on Corbis and Getty. And at Corbis and Getty, we're charging license fee to use, for example, a profile view of Rudyard Kipling, which is out of copyright because it's so old, the photograph, that the creator has died more than 70 years ago. But there's Corbis asking for like a 70-pound license fee to use that image, which is hosted on Wikimedia Commons, identical file size, right? So we have some equivalents to work from there, and then just working, with simple arithmetic, looking at digital licenses and how much they cost, we could try to get a picture of that. Now, of course, we could improve it by.
Can I ask you about that specific example, though? Are you saying that Corbis took the image from Wikimedia, or simply points to it and charges whatever it is, the 80 pounds as an overhead fee?
We don't know where the image originated on Getty or Corbis. It's possible that it did come from Wikimedia Commons, but we don't know that. We just know that they're identical in terms of what you see. We don't know if the file is exactly identical.
Got it.
We can improve this with, for example, willingness to pay metrics, and more sophisticated, economic studies would have to do that. And also, other ways to improve it might include things like trying to control for the aesthetic qualities of a work. And so we had this idea of maybe running 10,000 images through Amazon Turk and having them rated by external viewers to see if they were pretty or not. And so there's things we could do there to try to improve the calculation. But I think that really the purpose there was just to kind of get a sense of, look, if everybody had to pay the going rate for a digital license, here's what it all adds up to. And on your other question about, well, what are sustainable licensing models for sustaining open and collective projects? What a great question. And I think there's lots of that going on, right? We're having debates about that in academia and open publishing, and how to sustain open access journals, right? And I think it's similar to the questions which are going on with Wikipedia. So, putting the non-commercial clause on works, would require that an eventual commercial user would have to approach one to ask for permission, and maybe then there could be a discussion about licensing. One of the things which has come across in many of the research projects I've been working on is the problem of transaction costs being higher than the licensing that you earn from a single image or file or whatever. And this is a big problem with museums and archives, because when they want to open, digitize, and make available stuff which needs to be cleared through copyright, then it just creates an insurmountable barrier where new licensing innovations could make those things easier to make available.
As I recall, in one of your tables of log odds effects, using a share and share like license was a downer, though, wasn't it? One of the negative effects.
Yeah, it was negatively associated with off-site usage. What that means is that if a image was uploaded to the Wikimedia Commons with one of those viral licenses attached to it, it had lower odds of being found off of the Wikipedia family of pages.
Okay, but then extrapolating from that, it sounds like any effort to license or constrain the images, even if the revenue was going back to Wikimedia, would probably diminish the image's use.
Right, and here we're back at the Lander and Posner article about the sort of the bulge in the anaconda when it comes to how much restriction is optimal, and how much are we willing to accept, some form of restriction in order to generate revenue to sustain more creativity, and where should that be?
Where should that be? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to. Other folks have studied Wikipedia and its culture much more extensively, and I think that it'd be really interesting to know a little more about what they think about these different licensing options, and where they really draw the line in terms of they seem to have a very enthusiastic perspective on openness and making things available to all users, including commercial users. But there may be that there's some disagreements within the community about that.
So there's a fabulous question in the Q&A about the global distribution of these things, and I guess there's several ways to interpret this. how are your insights, what do your insights reveal about the way in which the Global South engages with Wikimedia Commons and other platforms? I mean, there's, in a sense, there's a question about what kinds of licenses do content generators from the Global South prefer? Do they contribute as much, or is there something about licensing that discourages their contributions?
That is a great question. In terms of our data set, we don't report on these precise TLDs where the images are found, but they are available in our data set because we machine read those. So we could potentially report on the distribution of off-page use by country by country. And we weren't able to make heads or tails of the geo-tagged information which accompanies images, either in terms of where they picture the object or the origin of the person who's the uploading and where they're located. But there is metadata on those things, and I think it would be something that would be possible to study, and I think it would make a great paper if somebody wanted to try to do that. Just one other anecdotal thing is that, you know, when I visited WIPO and talked to them about this, there were folks in the audience who were from the GLAM sector, the galleries, libraries, archives, museums, from Central and South America. And they were very interested in this concept of preserving a public domain that, you know, can be valorized through those institutions, and just generally the idea that it's important to carve out and protect, you know, the possibility of use of stuff which is not under copyright.
Right. Do you find that some IP regimes are more or less generous to these kinds of collectively managed resources? For example, I mean, so the Wikipedia, I guess, has grown up in US copyright law. It requires constant vigilance from the EFF and its own legal team to protect and assert copyright. And I imagine the same kind of organization born in Europe would face either different kinds of protections or different kind of constraints, or maybe different kinds of opportunities. Is it easier to start a collective resource like this in one IP regime or another?
Well, the only thing I can speak to here is, again, cultural heritage, interestingly. So when it comes to the use of orphan works, which are works which a museum or archive may have in their collection, but where the copyright owner is unknown, the ability of cultural institutions to use those has been easier in the United States, because the United States took steps to open that up and make that possible. But Europe brought in new regulations in 2014, which changed the landscape for the cultural institutions to reuse things. However, the European requirement is that the user has to do a diligent search on each item in order to free it to use it as an orphan work. And that transaction cost associated with diligent search was something that my colleagues and I studied. And what we found was that after you get to 10,000 works, it just creates way too much labor cost, you know, to be manageable. So we have to go back to the regulations and assess how to change them. The American approach was simpler. So yes, there are differences in national IP regimes, and folks study this in comparative legal kinds of studies. And it's something that we as researchers in online digital communities have to think about, right? Because we often make an assumption either of a single world or of a jurisdiction which predominates, like the US, with regards to things like freedom of expression and copyright and other things. So we need to be aware of those differences, and we need to build that into our research design to be sensitive to the differences.
Okay, so there's also a great question here about readdressing some of these balances, and it sounds like one mode at least is in research design to make sure that there's good representation from the varied experiences of different kinds of content producers with different kinds of IP regimes. What are the other things, perhaps what are the other things you would like to see in IP law that might help redress some of the imbalances you've mentioned on these platforms?
A right to remix. That's a big one, right?
That's the big one, yeah.
And you know, we were involved 8 years ago or so in coming up with some of the evidence which was used by the UK government in the introduction of the parody exception, which came into copyright law in the UK. I'd like to go back and revisit that and see how much impact the fair dealing exception for parody has had in terms of parodists' perceived ability to go and parodize copyright works on platforms like YouTube. So yeah, there are definitely, I think, carving out legitimate defenses for use of copyright works in places where it makes sense to do that. And that includes things like text and data mining for educational purposes, things like you know, non-commercial forms of use, like digitizing cultural heritage and things like that. Certainly, I think those are all important issues. And you know, it's interesting because in innovation studies and management studies literature, they're like, you know, patents are a thing you could do. You could get a patent on your innovation and go down that route, but there's all these other things you could do. You know, you could appropriate the value from your innovation through complementarities. You could do it through you know, strategic relationships with suppliers. There's lots of things, and so they don't tend to put so much emphasis on patent and the primacy of patent necessarily as the only way that you can generate economic value and growth. And it's weird to me that the creative industries discourse remains very much centered on copyright protection and its strength, where you know, I think clearly there's evidence that in fact there's a whole different set of ways that we generate value through creativity beyond proprietary exclusive rights.
But surely that's because that's where the lawsuits happen, right? So if you do parodize or you do remix with more than the right number of seconds that you're allowed to remix, that's when the Recording Industry Association will come after you, right? Isn't that's the reason why so much of the constraints really here are about the size of the remix, or the size of the amount of content, or the date of the work in which you need to work, not the value of the creative output.
Yeah, and even moving the needle in terms of scope, right? So we could talk about amount of borrowing, you know, maybe in terms of the, you know, proximity to the original, but even the scope. So like in the parody exception, there were concerns from rights holders that, you know, they would lose revenue because they wouldn't be able to license parodies effectively if there was an exception which allowed parody. In the orphan works legislation, there was concern from photographers that their photographs would become orphaned and would circulate freely on the internet. And you know, those concerns were valid, and I think they reflect concerns of the industry in the process of digitalization, that your photographs do circulate on the internet without attribution, and they are in a sense orphaned. And so there was a lot of resistance to introducing a new exception because of that. But I suppose it's important to focus on, as the other person asked a question, you know, it's important to focus on the overall picture in terms of cost and benefit to society, as well as to focus on how to draft these regulations narrowly so that they protect commercial exclusive interests, but they also allow optimal levels of reuse, which benefit us more widely.
Okay, there's another great question here. We have another 15 minutes together, so please pop your questions into the chat. Let's switch to Spotify and music. So there's a long-standing argument that Spotify doesn't actually work in the interests of its content creators. Is it possible for a platform like Wikimedia Commons to be adapted or adopted in a way that would support music and music distribution with equity, or in a way that encourages further creativity? Or are there actually different properties to a photo or a piece of music or a performance that actually make these things just too hard to reconcile. And the Spotify subscription mode is actually the most sustainable for music.
Wow, what a deep question, and a question that you could probably base a PhD or two because of the tangled mess that is the licensing regime for recorded music, and how it goes through collecting societies and to composers and performers, and legal experts study that for years. I guess I would say that I'm a big fan of work by Joel Waldfogel, who's done some interesting studies of digitalization's effects on music revenues, but also on total welfare, because he's an economist. And one of the main takeaways from his work is that digitalization might have reduced revenues for main core labels because it lengthened the tail for discovery of other kinds of music and independent acts. And it's not only because like search engines or like the sort of is it Chris Anderson's argument about like you have more shelf space on Amazon. It's not only that, it's also because we have music blogs and we have Instagram accounts and we have new ways of discovering and finding out about music that we like. And so that's really created a huge number of possible musical products for us to consume compared to before. And in that kind of environment, it's certainly unfavorable for big labels who's focusing, entirely on hits-based, products. But from a welfare optimizing point of view, from a policy point of view, there's potentially nothing wrong with that, because we've got more music, more works circulating and available, whether freely offered or behind a paywall or through a streaming service or not. So I'm interested in those transformations of things like the music industry. Another person to look into is my colleague Dave Hesmanhalsch here at the University of Leeds. And of course, he's written extensively about digitalization, but he has a new funded project which he's working on to do specifically with licensing and revenue for musical creators.
Fabulous. I guess another example of rapid and radical transformation is what Flickr did all of a sudden, right? 5 years ago. We may have, do we still have you there, Chris?
Just one moment, Phil. I think Chris is there for a second. We'll just try and get him back. If you want to just continue with the question, that would be great.
Hi. Well, I was just going to ask about Flickr. You may, those of you in the audience may remember a moment where Flickr was the fabulous platform for depositing your photos for a good 10, maybe 12 years. It was one of the early internet properties. Welcome back, Chris. It was one of the early internet properties, and maybe 5 years ago, it had always asserted that it might one day seize all the photos people had uploaded, but then maybe I'm getting the story wrong. Chris, do you remember this example of a big IP seizure?
I don't remember that precise example about Flickr, but of course we all are subject to that when we sign terms and conditions of use or click wrap license when we join these social media platforms with regard to we generally assign them a non-exclusive worldwide license to use and modify our works, in perpetuity. But that raises an important point, which comes through in my research on private collectives and open creative communities, in that if you get the licensing wrong at the beginning, and it's possible that an individual contributor to the collective could withdraw or enclose their contribution, then you set it up for disaster as the project develops, because as it finds new audiences and new contributors, if the original licensing regime isn't equipped to deal with those new contributions, then it can create schisms and disaster. And these kinds of enclosures of what were formerly open source, there's lots of stories of these in the tech history. A good example is the Netflix documentary Print the Legend. I recommend people check that out. It's about how a 3D printing company did that to their users, and the users didn't like it.
And so what are what's the means for redress? I haven't seen that documentary. It sounds great. What did the users do? Are there actually ways of collectively reasserting collectiveness in a collection?
This is so interesting, and it's not only a question for Wikipedia, although it's obviously important for them, but it's important for all digital creators that aren't large firms, right? We're starting to see conflicts erupt on YouTube when smaller YouTubers are having either IP disputes with each other because somebody will bite their style or take something of theirs, and so then it actually is a copyright dispute. And also where they might organize collectively against a larger external, maybe commercial user who uses and takes their content. And so we were used to thinking of intellectual property protection and disputes as sort of falling down from the top, that, there's some huge rights holder and then there's all of us. But now in this, flatter kind of digital environment, there's lots of differently sized and shaped users and borrowers of intellectual property. So it is actually a fairly complex issue, and I think it's worth studying more. I think that the intellectual property disputes between very small creators is an interesting thing worth looking at. I had a PhD student. We had a PhD student at the University of Glasgow named Shiona Burrow, and she studied the UK's IP small claims track, where photographers are the main users of that remedy, and they've her PhD accounts how they tried to protect their rights from larger users of their digital photographs. So that's one area of redress: is sue them in the small claims court.
Sue them back in small claims. Yeah. There's a couple questions left. We have a little less than 10 minutes. I'm going to end with the big one, which is, of course, the what to do about it question. And a great question here from Liam Bakirski. Have you done any work on open educational resources? How can you incentivize educators and faculty to contribute their resources to collective sources beyond copyright licenses or Creative Commons licenses, which are necessary but not sufficient?
What a great question, and what an interesting field site that would be for this kind of research. So I can only offer encouragement to you if that's something that you're interested in, to do this kind of research on that particular subset of users. I would imagine that the kinds of thresholds of selective incentives which are described in the literature on private collectives might also occur in educational material sharing. And so, for example, you may find that sharers might be motivated by reputational benefits or learning benefits for themselves, or other complementarities, maybe in their career progression or other things which together surmount the threshold required to induce them to share the stuff that they worked very hard on developing. And so those kinds of dynamics might be present in that sort of community as well. Maybe other dynamics. So, I just hope that in my presentation, and I've helped to excite you about the possibility of applying some of that innovation management concepts to things, other areas like creativity, or in your case, learning.
Can I ask, do you know anything about the Spark Authors Addendum? Have you ever used it? It's a little inside baseball. Did you ever use it for your journal submissions?
No.
So it's this. I guess it's a form of open educational resource. It's an addendum of 2 or 3 pages that we as academics could send to journals when they send us a publishing agreement that is incredibly long and complex and convoluted, and it simply asserts a set of rights that we have as academics, educators, the right to post our stuff on our own website, the pre-publication version. And there was a time when a lot of journal publishing deals would say, no, you can't even publish your own a PDF version of this on your website. So it's and the idea was that you would the journal would send you something that you had to sign to publish, and you would add your own 2-page addendum, sign it, and send it back to them and ask them to sign it and send it to you. And most journals editors would say, "What's this? I've never heard of this." And a few would sign it and return it, but but the large houses, Sage and Taylor and Francis, would simply say, I don't know what this is. If you don't want your article published, withdraw this.
Well, that rings true with my experience of publishing in edited volumes where there were quite militant and enthusiastic supporters of open rights as other co-authors, and we said that pretty much the same thing. Like, yeah, we won't sign the copyright agreement, and we will self-archive our materials and keep it open. And eventually, the publisher just gave up arguing with us, and we were able to do that. But that sounds like a really great initiative, and definitely something which is needed.
I think it's worth trying. Yeah. When next time we all get our articles. So let's end with the big question, which is, of course, what to do about it. What are the things that governments and regulators could do or change, and maybe which regulator? I mean, I imagine the European Commission is one of the regulators that actually has muscle that would do something. What would you want to see change, and who do you think would have the clout to change it?
I'll try my best there. I mean, I think I'll try to answer it in two. One is kind of where I see things going, and then where maybe interventions might happen. So in terms of where I see things going, I think that it's a major shift what's happened in Europe with the new copyright directive and with Article 17, because it changes it rebalances the burden of responsibility and the costs for detecting and reporting and removing infringing content. And it seems to put more liability on the shoulders of the platforms to monitor and make sure that user-generated content doesn't infringe traditional cultural industries' rights. And that really changes the ball game, because before, obviously, it was the responsibility of the rights holder to find the infringing item and issue a takedown notice that then the platform was expected to expeditiously follow up on. The users were trapped in there too. They didn't have a great situation necessarily under the previous intermediary liability regime, but that has changed a lot now. And we see it as well in the kind of things you're studying, Phil. And I think this is interesting, with regard to misinformation and other kinds of maybe hate speech, that there is appetite for putting more responsibility on platforms to regulate these behaviors. And in the world of intellectual property, what I think might happen is that platforms which already have a head start, like YouTube, where they have invested tremendous amounts of resources in things like Content ID and other algorithmic detection mechanisms, have a competitive advantage now in a regulatory landscape where smaller new upstart firms don't have. And that's why in the recitals of the European regulation, you see so much back and forth between the national regulators about putting in clauses relating to startups, because there was concern, even in the discussion of the law, that, hey, this could impact negatively the innovation environment for startups if we impose these kinds of costs on new platform entrants. So in a world where platforms are becoming more responsible for monitoring and dealing with maybe micro licensing between parties, intellectual property borrowing and things like that, it's not enough to focus only on the legal terrain. I think we need to be focusing on the sort of platform studies, internet studies, media studies terrain just as much, because we need evidence that is can be brought to debates about what's the appropriate thing to do. We need to know when it comes to like misinformation, we need to know about the extent to which there might be false positives in removals or false negatives, and how can we actually find out how much of one or the other we might get under different kinds of policy implementations. When it comes to freedom of expression and creativity, how many takedowns are we going to get in the new system? How many takedowns did we get before? And are we happy as a society if more stuff gets removed? Or do we want to try to maximize the amount of creative works which are available to all? So those debates need empirical evidence in order to be, move forward.
Yeah, I think it's, thank you so much for sharing the latest on your research. It's always interesting that many of us one-on-one like sharing, believe in contributing back, don't need to personally assert assert creativity until somebody else does, and that creates an environment which we competitively seek to seal off our outputs from use by others. Thank you again, Chris, very much for joining us today for the hour. Wonderful to see you in action again.
Thank you, Philip, and thanks everybody for having me.
Thank you both so much. And we really enjoyed the talk today, and thank you for giving us the time. And thank you everyone for attending as well. And you'll receive a follow-up email in due course. The OII are hosting our next webinar titled #Heroes versus Disinfo Dystopia, the Left, the Right and the Truth about Social Media Activism, with Professor Dean Freelon of the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media. Please visit the events page on the OII website to sign up. Thank you again and have a wonderful day.